Okay, so now we're going to talk about one of the most important roles that the media likes to claim for itself. It's one that we often think of as well. It's the idea of the media as a watchdog. And as the name suggests, the idea of a watchdog is one that it plays an important role in our democratic system. It is the media that plays this important role to watch what the government officials are doing and to bark to alarm us that we, the people, that the government officials are doing something and we need to be paying attention to it. They also, like a dog, investigate. They will dig up evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of the government not doing what it is that it's doing. And so it's digging in and grabbing onto the bone that they know is buried somewhere. It's all of those things that is the idea of the watchdog role. It's certainly a flattering idea to talk about this as an important role that they play in our political system. And they do have some justification for that because in the First Amendment to the US Constitution, one of the five freedoms that the framers put in was the idea of freedom of the press. The framers of the US Constitution recognized that the only way in which, even in a society like that in the 18th century, the only way in which most people found out about things was through the media. The media were very different. There were pamphlets and town criers and things like that, as opposed to blogs and Twitter accounts and things like that. But the idea was the same, is that in order for us to be able to interact in a democratic republic, the way in which if we needed to provide some input before the government would act, the government would have to ask our permission on some level in terms of whether or not they're doing a good job, whether their priorities are our priorities, the idea of popular sovereignty. All of those things required a freedom of the press. And so it is included as part of the five freedoms that we have. It is one freedom that is given to another institution. In this case, it's given to the media, but to help us because it hopefully, if given that freedom, the press will provide us with the information that we need to be good democratic citizens. It provides us with the tools to know whether or not we should reelect the President of the United States or whether or not we should be paying attention to a particular issue because it's going to be showing up in California as a proposition and how we should think about all of those things. And so whether it's indirect democracy, direct democracy, you're going to have an important influence, an important role for the press to provide us with this information to make good democratic decisions. Um, so the idea of the watchdog again is like the analogy suggests. The watchdog is going to stand in the middle and bark to warn us if there's something going on, whether good or bad. Generally, it tends to be something to alarm us, so it is one that they're on the watch, the media are on the watch to make sure the government is doing what it's supposed to, and if it's not, then they will bark to warn us that the government is moving in a direction that would not please us or potentially not please us, so we should be paying attention to what's going on. But they can also act like a dog in the sense of digging in the ground, looking for the bone, looking for that information to prove that in fact the government isn't doing what it's saying it's doing, it isn't living up to its promises, and all of those things. Flattering role, it's a role that we'd like to think is existing so that we don't necessarily have to do the hard work because it's hard to find that information. Um, the paradigmatic example of this is Watergate, the idea that two reporters were able to follow the leads and to use top secret sources, secrets, things like that. People, government officials were willing to provide information to them at key points. Deep Throat is the name of that individual. These are things that led to the conspiracy that went all the way to the White House under President Nixon. And the President Nixon had agreed to allow some burglars to go into the Watergate, to go into the offices of the campaign of his rival in the election to find out what's going on so that they can have a better response to those election plans and things like that. So that tends to be the paradigmatic one because it was one that demonstrates that the press was working like a watchdog and acting like a watchdog, uncovered information that seemed really hard to find out and uncover things that people at the outset didn't really think was going to happen. And in the end, Nixon resigned. He was facing impeachment. Facing removal from office, but in the end he resigned because and the evidence came to a large extent because of journalists who were refusing to take no for an answer, to take the official line of government officials saying he's not a crook, that these things aren't happening, that these are lies, that these are things to undermine the authority of the government and to besmirch his great character and things like that. And so it is something along the lines of the best case of what the idea of the watchdog role can and should be. And some argue that the media sort of learned the wrong lesson from that, and that they decided that the lesson of Watergate is never to trust the government and to seek out everything would be a gate. So Monica Gate, Travel Gate, everything became akin to or similar to the dynamics of Watergate, which then has an influence on we the people because the journalists keep that we shouldn't trust the government and what it does. And so it undermined the trust that we had in government. And if in fact, as we talked about, the idea of compromise, the idea of trust is fundamental to the idea of democracy, the actions taken by journalists as a whole to be seeking out that every single example of a politician acting in a strange way or something like that is one that is conspiracy to the level of Watergate, has some influence. At the same time, they are influenced by the same sort of pressures we talk about in the textbook, and we'll talk about a little bit longer or a little bit later in this lecture, is the idea that the things that became Watergates, things that became investigated were of how the government was doing its job, but instead it was scandals. It was talking about sexual scandals, talking about that a mistress was found or someone was meeting secretly with someone and things like that. And so the idea of Watergate was then transformed a little bit because of the influence of the profit motive and what sort of skills were being uncovered. And so the other thing is to argue that the watchdog role makes a lot of sense. It's easy to define on previous exams and previous iterations of this course. When there's an essay portion to the exam, I'll ask people to think about the watchdog role, and they'll often talk about it. It's relative to talk about it in a positive way because it links to freedom of the press and the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It talks about the important role of cultural institution in our political system. But at the same time, as we're about to talk about, if in fact there are other influences on the media, if taking a look at the original figure of a pictorial representation of the media and its influence on politics, if the profit motive, the corporate ownership of media that leads to the profit motive for the media influences the sort of stories that they cover, the way in which they cover those stories, then this institution, the press, that is supposed to be watchdogs, might actually have a different sort of things that they're going to emphasize. And so one of the ways in which I think about this is to talk about that maybe in reality the media are not watchdogs, but instead they're watch llamas. The reason I say watch llamas is because in investigating some of these things, and it's pretty easy to do, you can find newscasts that will spend quite a bit of their time talking about things like a surfing llama, and they're really fun to watch. Surfing llamas are really cool. Llamas are not things you expect to surf, and so it does a human interest aspect to it. The individual decided that a llama should actually be surfing is actually kind of fun. But if the priorities of the media are different enough that what they want to do is to do those human interest stories, they want to do things to make sure that people watch the newscast in the first case, and that people won't tune in to find out about some important information about debates about healthcare in the United States. Instead, they want to watch the surfing llamas, then the role of the media has changed because of other influences. Doesn't mean they don't try to do some of the things that they say in terms of holding government officials accountable for their actions, finding out what we the people want. But if the amount of time on the newscast is spent more on these human interest stories, these fun stories to make sure that people actually watch the newscast, then it changes the way in which the media portrays what government is doing, because they're not even talking about it at all. And so one way to kind of hold this idea of the negative alternative view is the idea of a watch llama, because instead we're watching videos of llamas on surfboards and things like that. But it could be water skiing squirrel, it could be other sort of happy news and things like that we know that on the few times we actually turn into local TV news, that there's often some emphasis on those happy stories, those fun stories and things like that. But that will then take away from the amount of time that's available for some of the more interesting and important things we need to know to be good democratic citizens.